por su primera charla y ahora por la segunda. Es para mí un placer presentarlo el día de hoy y presentar más al rato a la doctora Fernanda Duarte. Tenemos un par de charlas también muy emocionantes, muy exciting, como parte de este tercer día de webinars en Latinx Camp. Entonces, me voy a permitir hacer una pequeña presentación del profesor Carreira, y para el beneficio de aquellos que estén conectados en YouTube, lo voy a hacer en inglés. Professor Carreira was born in Havana, Cuba in 1963. He obtained a BS degree in 1984 from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign under the supervision of Scott Denmark, and later on a PhD degree in 1990 from Harvard University under the supervision of David Evans. After carrying a postdoctoral research stay with Peter Derban at Caltech, in 1992, he joined the faculty at the same institution as an assistant professor of chemistry, and later on was promoted to the rank of associate professor of chemistry in the spring of 1996 and full professor in the spring of 1997. He then moved to ETH Zurich in Switzerland as a full professor in 1998. Professor Carreira is a member of both the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Among many other prizes and recognitions, he also is the co-founder of 3 startup companies and has been involved in the development of several chemistry education software tools. In 2018, he was appointed as the editor-in-chief of Organic Letters from the ACS, where he had previously served as an associate editor for 18 years. Starting in 2021, this year, he serves as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Chemical Society. His research program focuses on the asymmetric synthesis of biologically active stereochemically complex natural products and complex multi-step synthesis, an endeavor which provides a goal-oriented setting within which to engage in reaction innovation and design. Growing from the areas of organometallic chemistry, coordination chemistry, molecular recognition, Carreira's group is developing synthetic methods based on catalytic and stoichiometric regions for asymmetric stereo control. His group is also involved in medicinal chemistry and chemical biology in collaboration with research groups in academia and industry covering the range of biology and medicine. It's an honor, it's a pleasure to have you here within the context of Latinx Chem. Thank you very much. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Joaquin. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you, Gabriel, for the opportunity to be a part of this symposium. I'm going to have to give this talk in English. I have found, I can give talks in Spanish, but I have found from experiences, that's mostly in Spain, it takes me about a week before I can make the complete switch, since I otherwise don't have an opportunity to practice this wonderful language of ours often. So again, I'm honored to be a part of this presentation. I hope we have many more of these things. I hope we have these things in person in the future again, so that we have a lot to discuss and a lot to promote for our community, because we have a lot of contributions to make for the benefit of the science and the benefit of humanity as a whole. So I hope I can be a part of that, and I'm willing to help in any way I can to promote our community. I want to share with you today 2 vignettes, 2 short stories of work that we're doing in somewhat traditional area, natural products total synthesis. This has been published this year, so it's fairly recent, and I'm going to include data that didn't appear with the original publications that represent additional studies that we've done since their appearance. Let me start off by saying that I have looked at some of the presentations and posters in the Latinx 4 from Mexico, from Colombia, and Brazil that I found rather interesting and pertinent to what I do. I recently published a paper on triazoles for click chemistry. And so I was delighted to see this paper, this presentation by Vinicio Mena from Mexico. As was mentioned in my introduction, I'm also interested in medicinal chemistry, and the talk towards the end will include some concepts of that. And so I found the talks by Melo and Diaz, also very interesting. And since I'm a synthetic chemist at heart, the presentation by Emanuele on the synthesis of asparagine derivatives was fascinating. So there's great science going on, and I'd like to see that promoted, and I'd like to see that appear in the very best of journals. So the talk outline is shown on this slide. I'm going to talk about two projects. The synthesis of fufurocainin A, you'll see in a moment, is a diterpenoid. We chose it because of its complexity, in the hopes that that complex structure would inspire us to develop methods or new tactics. Part of the exercise of working on a complex molecule then is the integration or amalgamation of those tactics into a strategy that addresses more general questions that are unique to that class of secondary metabolites. I then want to move on to a very different class of compounds that's captivated our interest, so-called mutanobactans A, B, and D. Like any total synthesis endeavor, they also invite considerations in synthetic methods, tactical development, and strategy. But these particular molecules, which are human-derived, by the way, are of interest to us because their structures were not well known. They're not readily available since they come from human beings, and they have some fascinating biology, as I hope to illustrate for you some of our preliminary results in that area. So let me start off. Oh, let me point out there's been a great review recently in the Swiss magazine Chemia by a group at Novartis. You can see that this appeared in 2021, where they make the case that this is a company, a leading company in pharmaceuticals, that the chemistry of natural products and their biology remain an extremely interesting and pertinent area to study as it guides discoveries in new therapies and new drugs. And so my expectation is that we can merge synthesis, the kinds of things that we like to think about as chemists, with concepts in biology and drug discovery through these very kinds of exercises. So here's euphoricanin. It was isolated not long ago from a group in China. It's a plant that's common to the Chinese traditional medicine, and it's associated with all sorts of ailments, to treat all sorts of ailments. And to be honest, though, what we were attracted by was this complex ring system consisting of 5, 6, 7, and 3 fused ring skeletons with unsaturation, as you can see, in the A rings and the B ring. Let me see if I can find a pointer, just a moment. I don't see about a point. Can you see my arrow? I don't know if you can see the arrow I'm moving around.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So this is a new structural class of the ingenanes, and we thought it would be a wonderful forum to examine some underexplored reactions. What you see here is the retrosynthetic approach, how we started to disconnect this and identify problems. So we thought of making this hydroxylactone by an intramolecular addition to an alpha-ketolactone. And in turn, that distills onto this lactone at the far right with the 2 key bonds in red. And what we wanted to do was to make those bonds at the same time. And what we considered doing was a ketyl radical cyclization in which a cycloheptanone would add to the unsaturated ester and in one step lead to formation of the lactone. To put it another way, what we wanted to do, as shown here in the center of the slide, was to connect the carbonyl carbon to the beta carbon of the ester and the oxygen of the carbonyl, maybe not that exact oxygen, to the carbonyl carbon of the ester in what would be a net to electron reduction process and give rise in one step to this complex fused ring system. So the idea was to focus on that and make it a reality in the context of a complex route to this molecule, in the context of a route to this complex molecule. To continue with the retrosynthesis, we identified that this could all be done from carine as the starting material. So it's what Corey would call a structure goal-based analysis once we had done this disconnection. So the synthesis of that starting material, the cycloheptenone, was fairly straightforward and by and large known in the literature. We refined it and made it work on large scale. It involves ozonolysis of 3-carine, which is commercially available. That gives rise to a ketoaldehyde. And that ketoaldehyde, under the ozonolytic conditions, is subjected to a selective deprotection of the aldehyde as a dimethyl acetal. In a subsequent step, the ketone is subjected to enolization and silation to give the silylenol ether shown in the middle of the slide. And then this is subjected to a Mukayama type addition reaction, where the onium that's produced by the acetal undergoes addition by the enolsilane and elimination, ultimately giving the cycloheptenone, the key starting material, in 20% over those four steps in a process that could be easily scaled up. So what do we do next as we move along to the key structure in that step that I discussed in the previous slide? We combine the conjugate addition of a methyl cuprate onto the cycloheptenone with an aldol addition reaction to this aldehyde that's derived from the Roche ester. That gives rise to this product in the middle here in 80% yield as a single diastereomer. The secondary alcohol is protected as the silyl ether, as I show you here. And then we needed to introduce in this molecule a 1-carbon unit on the other side of that ketone. But while that could have involved reaction with a chloroformate followed by reduction and protection, we decided to explore some unusual chemistry in this step. And it involved treating the dithiene with sulfuryl chloride to give this chlorodithiene. This can be used as an electrophile that reacts with the enolate derived from the ketone to give rise to this product, in effect introducing a protected form of a carbonyl, of an aldehyde. This was reported some years ago in tetrahedron letters. It's not a method or a reagent that's been used much, but we found it quite convenient. The protection of the primary alcohol, that is to say, removal of the paramethoxybenzyl group, followed by oxidation of that alcohol to the aldehyde, gives this key intermediate. And finally, we subject that aldehyde to a Horner-Watts with Emmons olefination to give the unsaturated ester, and that proceeds in 65% yield. So at this point, we're ready to do the key reaction, the key method that we wanted to explore. Whoops, sorry, I didn't see. At the bottom, I highlight one more time that we found this chlorodithiene to be a rather convenient protected equivalent of a chloroformaldehyde, chloroformate, which is otherwise not stable. This decomposes readily to HCl and CO. In a retrosynthetic sense, it's the equivalent of the formocation, protonated CO, that is otherwise not feasible in these kinds of transformations. There is the famous Gattermann Koch that requires high pressure with CO and HCl, but these kinds of more complex structures would not be tolerant of those kinds of conditions. So here's the key reaction. It took a long time to get here, but I'll get right to the point. We treated this compound with samarium diiodide in the hope of doing that 2-electron cyclization. And what we found was that indeed the ketyl derived from the ketone adds to the unsaturated ester and gives rise to the tertiary alcohol that we were interested in. Compare that to the structure up here in the box that gives us the tertiary alcohol exactly as we want it. But take note of the fact that this has not formed the lactone that we were looking for. And the reason that it has not formed the lactone is that it's the wrong diastereomer at C3. You can see that we need that to be moving stereochemically the other diastereomer facing us in order for that to undergo a lactonization reaction. So that's a key downfall of this process. Now, we began to think about this so that we could attempt to fix it. We considered that perhaps samarium was playing a key role beyond just providing 2 electrons, serving to bridge the 2 oxygens, the ketyl oxygen that takes you from the ketone to the tertiary alcohol, and the ester carbonyl oxygen. You can see that in this transition state that I've drawn at the bottom of the slide, this particular arrangement ends up minimizing interactions that would otherwise be present in the unfavorable transition state, which is the one we actually want, because that would give the proper stereochemistry that leads to the lactone. In that transition state, one would experience destabilizing interactions between the alpha carbon and this methine H, and that's perhaps why we don't observe this diastereomer that's otherwise a desired one that we want to prepare. So obviously when faced with this problem, you want to see what you can do about fixing it. And so we go back to the key criteria that we're using in our working mechanism. We're assuming that the samarium coordinates to both carbonyls, initially the ketone and the ester that undergo the transformation to the tertiary alcohol. And so it occurred to us that a way forward might be to examine the cis-enoate, the cis diastereomer of the ester. And I'll show you later on why we thought that was important. So how do you generate a cis ester? Well, still in Gennari some years ago reported that if you use the electron deficient Horner-Wadsworth-Emmons reagent shown here, for reasons that are well understood today, give you the corresponding cis ester that I show you on this slide in net 76% yield. When we subject this to the samarium diiodide conditions that I described earlier, and it's pretty straightforward, samarium diiodide and THF, this time we get as a single product, an 89% yield, exactly what we wanted. The 5-membered ring lactone that has also led to the formation of the cyclopentenyl ring fused to that gamma lactone. So why is this working? We go back to the model that I presented earlier. We think that what's key here is the bridging function of the samarium between the carbonyl oxygen and the ester oxygen. When it is the cis ester that participates in the reaction, only one transition state is possible if you want the samarium to bridge those two oxygens. And that's the one that I've shown here that gives rise to the cis configured side chains that then lead to the lactone in the product. The alternative, because this is the cis ester, would not allow the samarium to bridge those two oxygens. So with that key reaction in place, and because of that key reaction, we're able to quickly complete the synthesis of this rather complex enginame. The protection of the dithion is accomplished under conditions developed by Stork many years ago using this hypervalent iodine reagent. That gives rise to an aldehyde, 95% yield. The aldehyde is converted into the homologated dibromide, Corey-Fuchs type chemistry. That's subjected to a deprotection of the secondary alcohol and elimination, installing the requisite double bond that we need in ring A, as you can see up here. With the dibromide in hand, you can see that we need to introduce a methyl group and a means of functionalizing that group so that we can add to a ketolactone. That's accomplished by this reaction that was first reported by Tanino and Miyashita back in 2006. If you treat the terminal geminal dibromide with methyl cuprate, that effectively metallates the more accessible bromide to give you a vinyl cuprate that then participates in a 1-2 rearrangement and extrusion of the remaining bromide, introducing the methyl group and a copper at this position. That copper then is subjected to iodination and ultimately gives rise to this compound in 74% yield. With the vinyl iodide in hand, we're ready to try a key reaction once we've installed the alpha ketolactone that we need. So installation of the alpha ketolactone as this carbon is readily done by its deprotonation with hexamethyl disilazid, followed by Davis oxyziridine to install the alpha hydroxylactone that is then oxidized to the ketolactone as shown here in net 49% yield for those steps. Interestingly enough, treatment of the vinyl iodide with T-butylithium, even in the presence of this ketolactone, which is a rather reactive species, the vinyl iodide undergoes a preferential metal halogen exchange to give a vinyl iodide that rapidly adds to the ketone, ultimately giving rise to euphoricanin itself. And what you can gather is a fairly quick synthesis of this molecule. And it's a fairly quick synthesis of this molecule precisely because of that step that allows us to introduce that lactone and the 5-membered ring in that single transformation. We continue to study this because access to these various intermediates allow us to pose some interesting questions about biosynthesis of these novel engenames and to then start to carve out some of the SAR that might be necessary to understand and validate the medicinal properties that have been suggested for this complex structure. Let me now move on to the other project that I promised you. And I introduce it with this slide, which is one of my favorite slides ever. It basically describes for you the irreducible representation of the formula, the chemical formula for a human being. Notice that you would have to multiply this by an appropriate number of n's. And the reason I present this is because it's fascinating. It's probably not accurate because it obviously depends on what you've eaten and what you've been exposed to over a lifetime. But to me, it suggests that there are many fascinating molecules within that formula, beyond the DNAs, the peptides, the proteins, the sugars, beyond the lipids. There are small molecules that are unique to us humans. For example, you know already of some of them, prostaglandins and isoprostanoids, that have phenomenal biology, that are difficult to isolate, difficult to synthesize. And this is where the activity of synthesis can play a key role in elucidating their biological function. And I want to share the story of a molecule. We've been in this area for a while, and I've published about some isoprenoid prostaglandin chemistry and isoprostanoids. I want to share with you today a completely different set of natural products that also emanate from human beings. I'm sure you've all heard of the human microbiota and the human microbiome. It has been appearing increasingly so, some exciting results in this area in the very top journals in science, as well as the popular press. The Scientific American in the United States, the Scientist, Der Spiegel in Germany, the Economist in the UK comment about this and how important are the organisms that live within us and allow us to maintain a healthy state. Let me give you a little bit further background just so that we're all on the same page. The human microbiome itself is made up of anywhere from 500 to 1,000 different species of microorganisms. And in effect, there are more microbial cells than there are human cells in us. That also goes for the genetic makeup. While there are about 22,000 human genes, there are 3.3 million non-redundant genes of the microorganisms that live within us. And it's been referred to as the second genome, or the invisible human organ. As I suggested on the previous slide, it's been suggested to have a huge influence on health. Anyone who's taken antibiotics recently, such as I did, because I had an infection a few weeks ago, knows the horrible effect that while it may cure the bad infection, it has a horrible effect on your stomach and intestinal flora that can cause some dysfunction for a few weeks until your system is back in equilibrium. And so there are major academic and industrial investments in this area and understanding these organisms, how they interact with each other, and how they interact with us. It's expected that by 2024, it'll be over a $2 billion market. As a synthetic chemist and someone that's interested in biology, we simply seek to understand the molecular language that's used in this complex setting for the organisms to communicate with each other and the organisms to communicate with human beings. And that language is small molecule natural products, among other things. There are also peptidic and oligonucleotide and oligosaccharide languages that are used. But what we want to focus on in particular is the small molecule natural products. Let's face it, they're not easy to isolate. It's not easy to extract things from human. And I should point out that in many cases, these natural products are only produced by these organisms when they're in their natural host. If you try to culture these organisms outside of their competitive environment, these genes remain silent. So let me show you what some of those look like. You can see peptidic natural products on this slide. I won't talk about any of these, but these have been the subject of studies and have fascinating chemistry and biology associated with them. Colibactin on the bottom left has been studied by Hertzon and Crawford, and it's as well as Balskas at Harvard, and it's a fascinating story associated with that. What we're going to focus on today is the human oral microbiome. And in that human oral microbiome are hundreds of microorganisms. And we became interested in this particular project because of our interest in Candida albicans. It's a fungal yeast that lives in our mouths. Most of the time, it's perfectly under control. It lives in our skin, our mouth, our guts, all sorts of orifices, nose. And as long as you're healthy, your body can deal with its presence. Occasionally, things get out of balance, and then it turns into candidiasis. And the yeast form that otherwise in a healthy individual looks like this, and panel A starts to develop hyphae and turns into a very dangerous form, panel B. And this can turn into all sorts of different pathologies. Panel C shows you what is known in English as oral thrush, not a very nice looking infection here, fungal infection of the mouth. And this can be a problem, especially for immunocompromised patients. Now, we became interested in this by reading a publication that had appeared by David Chichevitz at the University of Oklahoma in a natural products journal. And what he was doing at the time was studying another bacteria that lives in our mouth, namely Streptococcus mutans. This is also the bacteria, by the way, that's responsible for cavities or caries. He was studying a particular gene cluster in this bacteria, and he noticed that that particular gene cluster produces a class of natural products known as mutanobactins and mutanolins that he himself discovered. In particular, he noticed that when things were healthy, and mutants, even though it does cause cavities, is kept under control, Candida itself is also under control and we're in a healthy state. When he looked at Streptococcus mutans, in which the gene that produces mutanobactins and mutanolins is knocked out, however, then Candida adopts this hyphae state and thereby leads to oral thrush. So there's clearly a connection between the healthy state of the individual and the presence of Streptococcus mutans. For all the bad things that it does with cavities, it appears to be producing a set of natural products, mutanobactins and mutanolins, that are important for keeping a healthy balance and keeping Candida albicans in the non-pathogenic state. So we wanted to investigate these natural products and ultimately investigate the biology associated with these natural products. And on this slide, I show you the collection of natural products. I misspoke a little bit. Let me point out that Robert Chichevitz basically is responsible for mutanobactins A, B, C, and D, and he's the pioneer in this area. He isolated them from Streptococcus mutans. Very small amounts of these things were isolated. As I mentioned already, mutanobactin A controls morphology and pathogenicity of C. albicans. He hinted at the fact that there was inter-kingdom communication with that observation. And as much as he tried, unfortunately, not all of these could be perfectly assigned, especially as it relates to the stereochemistry at these two positions, the position between the ketoamide functional groups and the secondary alcohol. It's a different group in Canada that isolated, let me correct myself again, that reported mutanobactins E through H and I and J, as well as mutanolins A and E, F. I need to correct myself because these actually weren't isolated. These are presumed to be present as well in the isolates, but they're only studied in the context of rapid screening and mass spectrometry analysis. So clearly, stereochemistry cannot be established for these remaining natural products, and they pose some interesting problems thereby. I should also point out that when Robert Chichevitz did the knockout experiments and basically focused on what happens with mutanobactins A through D, the experiment was probably also knocking out these other ones that have been suggested. So we have a very interesting scenario here where the organism is producing, a dozen different natural products, and it's not clear what the effect of some of these, the large majority of these, is on the phenotypic response of what's being observed with Candida albicans. So I'm going to start off with a focus on mutanobactin D. That's the easiest one of these, and the one that we decided to address first, vis-a-vis the structure and the stereochemical assignment. Now, as a chemist, when you look at mutanobactin D, I've highlighted the section in yellow that is perhaps more interesting as a synthetic chemist. That's going to require some thinking synthetically, because most of the other sections of the natural product represent naturally occurring amino acids. As a synthetic chemist interested in reactivity patterns, one would see the beta-hydroxyketoamide and wonder whether that pattern, highlighted in the yellow box now, might be susceptible to elimination reactions to give a Michael acceptor. Maybe that's responsible for the biological effects of the mutanobactams. It might also be, as a ketoamide, susceptible to enolization. Maybe that's responsible for the biological activity. One can also imagine retroaldol, which would give rise to an aldehyde enol, and possibly retroclasin reactions with cleavage of C26, C28 bond to give rise to decanoic acid derivatives, and another peptide that might be itself responsible for the biological activity. The point I'm trying to make here is that through synthesis, we can explore all these possibilities involving reaction chemistry of the mutanobactams. So I've highlighted in yellow in the previous slide and red on this slide the fragment that for us represented the most challenging aspect of this structure. And in order to prepare this, and we looked at a variety of different approaches, we ultimately decided to prepare this beta-hydroxyketone by looking to make the heterocycle, this isoxazoline, shown here in red. And that comes about from studies that we carried out many years ago, back in 2001, on a method that we reported that involved the stereoselective cycloaddition reaction of nitrile oxides and olefins. As you'd expect from a cycloaddition reaction that is stereospecific, if you pick one olefin, cis, over the other, you get complementary stereochemical patterns in the isoxazolines that are produced. Because the isoxazolines can be subjected to NO bond reduction and hydrolysis, that allows you to access beta-hydroxy ketones, either in the syn manifold or anti-manifold, easily and conveniently from this single cycloaddition process. And we discussed this in a paper in 2001. I show you some of the things that you can do and that emanate from that paper. So if you use cis-allylic alcohols or trans-allylic alcohols with these more complex nitrile oxide precursors, you can access the whole panoply of masked aldol adducts that contain various permutations, stereochemical permutations that are typically found in a lot of polyketones. Of course, after you reduce the NO bond and hydrolyze the carbon-nitrogen imine. Now, for the purposes of mutanobactam D, we had to address a different problem because we're interested in making this building block back here, and that would require an enantioselective cycloaddition reaction. In this particular process, the chlorohydroxamate serves as the nitrile oxide precursor, and we wanted to undergo cycloaddition to this enoate. Fortunately, Ukaji and Inomata in 1998 had reported a variation of the process that I show you here, in which this particular allylic alcohol was subjected to a variety of different cycloaddition reactions, and it involves the use of diethyl zinc and diisopropyl tartrate. So we were able to develop this methodology further so that it would work on this particular combination of reactants. And that gives rise to the cycloaddict, as you can see, in decent yields and an excellent DE as the first step in the synthesis of this building block. Now, with that building block in hand, we encountered serious problems in what we thought was going to be the easiest part of this sequence, namely subjecting that primary alcohol to a displacement reaction, because you'll realize when I direct your attention to the molecule in the box up here, what we need is a primary amine at that position. Try as we may, we couldn't do that substitution reaction. We are pretty much cued in as to what was happening. Whenever we activated that alcohol in the form of a leaving group, you can think of mesylates, triflates, or turn it into a halide. Invariably, what happened was that an enolate is formed and that leaving group is displaced, which gives rise to these interesting building blocks. These can be identified at low temperature, but upon warming, then undergo rapid decomposition. So we were faced with this difficulty, and necessity is the mother of invention, as the expression in English goes. And we then identified this rather interesting process, and I'll go into more detail in the next slide. if you take the primary alcohol and subject it to a base, an amine base, 10 minutes, what you see is quantitative formation of this lactone. Now look carefully, because it's more than just a simple lactone formation. What's happened is that an epimerization has taken place at this position, and we have gone from the R configuration to the S configuration. And much like in the previous project that I told you about, the fact that these substituents are now cis allows the cis lactone to be formed. Interestingly enough, cis lactones of this type can be subjective to nucleophilic opening reactions. And so that's what we did here. When you treat this with potassium azide and 18 crown 6 and sulfolane at 70 degrees, the lactone is opened up to give you the azide at this position. But once again, I ask you to look carefully, because out of sheer luck, in that same process where we installed the azide, this center has epimerized back to the R configuration. So we got lucky. It's an interesting set of reactions. The base can epimerize the lactone to give you the ester, to give you the lactone. That sets us up for opening by the azide. And once it's open and can no longer form a ring, it reverts to the trans-substituted isoxazoline, and that's how we get back to the desired configuration, R, alpha to the acid. I guess I just went through that description. I guess I don't need this slide, but here it is in a bit more detail, which I'll go through quickly. An amine base epimerizes the ester at C3. Notice that kind of makes sense, right? Because it's alpha to an ester and alpha to an oxime, or to an imine, to the cis. That's an equilibration process. And when it attains the cis configuration, that can quickly shut down, since we're under alkaline conditions, to the lactone. Lactone, because of the unique strain associated with it, it's susceptible to opening. And then because this position 3 is still susceptible to base epimerization, it reisomerizes to the trans arrangement. So a little bit of luck, and we're able to generate this fragment rather expeditiously. So the synthesis of Mutanobactam D then with this fragment is shown on this slide. It involves solid phase synthesis techniques, which we had to learn. We've never done this before. And I had a very talented student that was willing to pick that up. We quickly assembled the peptide domain. And then in the last step, put in this building block whose synthesis I just showed you in the previous slide. The azide that we put in through a lactone opening reaction is reduced under Staudinger conditions to give you the amine. And then that is subjected to cleavage off the resin and cyclization at the same time to give rise to this macrocycle in 75% yield. So we're almost there. We could do spectroscopic studies on this intermediate and show that these H's were syn to each other, and thereby these two substituents are trans and contains the configuration at 25 and 26 that we were aiming for based on some hypotheses that we had. Of course, I remind you that the tactic that we had chosen doing the dipolar cycloaddition reaction would have enabled us to have made any, and in fact, we ultimately made all of the possible permutations of this particular fragment. Finally, then, we were able to reduce the NO bond with this unusual reagent, the tricarbonyl complex of molybdenum, and that proved critical in acetonitrile to give rise in 91% yield to this structure, whose NMR characteristics matched that had been reported by Robert Chichovitz, which meant that we now had an assignment at C25 and C26. Now, over the next 6 months, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that because that requires a real aficionado of structural elucidation. We ended up convincing ourselves that nothing funny had taken place during these various steps, during these deprotections. You can imagine that in the step that we cleave the NO bond and hydrolyze the imine, you might be experiencing retroaldols and realdolisation and or epimerization, which would scramble the configuration at C25 and C26. And if I had another 15 minutes, I'd spend time doing that. Let me just highlight some of the things that we did. For example, we were able to show that you could reduce the beta hydroxy ketone and derivatize it and carry out spectroscopic studies that enabled us to fully characterize, once again by a different means, the configuration alpha to the ketone and beta to the ketone, namely the hydroxide. So with this synthesis in hand, we've been able to explore the reaction landscape of metanobactin. I should point out that the configuration at C25, C26 that I just highlighted is the thermodynamically preferred configuration for this natural product. We've made the other ones, and three of the other three, two epimerize to metanobactin D. Now, you might recall in the slide where I presented the family, there were somewhat more complicated structures that contained this thiazepinone here. And so we proceeded next to address the synthetic challenges posed by this unusual amino acid. We've developed two different approaches, one that I'll term thiazepinone first. So through a sequence that I won't discuss, we make this building block, this unusual amino acid, and then incorporate it into a peptide. That has some interesting features. I just don't have the time to discuss it. But we've also developed a different and complementary route where that thiazepinone is put in last. We can do this route because of the prior work that I just shown you. And the idea was that in that second route, we would synthesize an intermediate shown here on the resin. And the hope was that upon treatment with acid, when you choose the appropriate linker, namely an acetal linker, this is cleaved off the resin to give an aldehyde, at the same time that a ketal is deprotected. And the expectation was that if you generate the enol form of the ketoamide in the presence of that aldehyde, during the cleavage from the resin, that will give rise to metanobactins A, and B, and if you pick the right precursors, metanobactin D, whose synthesis I already showed you, but now through a very different approach. The advantages of the first route is that I'm interested in medicinal chemistry, and so this gives rise to these novel building blocks, this unusual amino acid shown in the middle. The advantage to the second route is that you can access diversity very rapidly and potentially access all of the metanobactins and all of the mutanolins that I showed you previously. So let me finish off my presentation by just highlighting what we've made through this route. Through the first route, we've been able to make the compound where R is H. So it's the peptide lacking the lipid. And that's, I should tell you, is completely inactive. So it's this combination of lipid and peptide and this lipopeptide that renders these molecules active. I want to highlight the synthesis of metanobactins A and B through this second generation sequence. We attach this carboxylic acid acetal to a resin, an aminomethyl polystyrene resin. And then we proceed to do peptide synthesis, as I show you here. When we get to this terminal primary amine, we attach this carboxylic acid. It's a beta keto acid with a ketone group protected as a dioxylane. And that gives rise to this key intermediate. As I hinted at before, when we treat this with TFA, trifluoroacetic acid, and water with thioanazole to trap any unwanted carbocations, this reaction leads directly to metanobactins A and B, overall 5% yield for all of these steps. So it's a considerably streamlined synthesis for this more complex structure over that which I presented to you for metanobactin D. I'll go into a little bit more detail as to what's happening here, but just to summarize, we're seeing ketone deprotection, so here, thiol deprotection here under the same acidic conditions. We're seeing resin cleavage that involves hydrolysis of this acetal. We believe we're seeing thionium formation. I'll discuss that in a little more detail in a moment, and ultimately macrocyclization. Let me show you some of that in a little greater resolution. So the trifluoroacetic acid is affecting hydrolysis of two dioxylanes, the one that masks the ketone, highlighted here in red, and the one that masks the aldehyde, also highlighted in red. And so we believe that it's that hydrolysis that's giving rise to an aldehyde, cleavage off the resin, and the enol form of that ketone that ultimately provides metanobactin D for this particular intermediate. If instead of that intermediate, you've carried through the thiol, that ultimately provides metanobactin A and D, and there are two possible approaches that you can consider here. One is that the enol adds to the aldehyde, And then in a condensation process, that undergoes an elimination reaction. Following that elimination reaction, thiol adds, and that's what leads to mutanobactans A and B. The configuration of these two centers being controlled by the other stereocenters in the macrocycle. But there's an alternative pathway, and this is where it's good. You know, I was talking about writing papers. This is where we thought of these things. It's good to have lots of voices, lots of input. There's an alternative pathway that you can consider that's actually, I think, even more exciting. Even instead of an aldol condensation, as I showed you on the right here, you first form a thiohemiacetal and possibly a thionium, as I show you here. Then the last step of the sequence would be an aldol addition to that thionium, giving rise to mutanobactin A and B. It's a different pathway. Maybe both are operating, but what's exciting about this second pathway is that it would account for the formation of mutanobactins I and J in the mass spec experiments that have been suggested by McGarvey in Canada about 2 years ago, but never validated in the sense that we natural products chemists like to validate. So we're going back and looking, in fact, for these kinds of intermediates and seeing it by chance. We've basically also made mutanobactins A, I, and J. In the interest of time, let me just finish up with a few slides on biology. And this has required collaboration with Professor Christina Schäfer in Vienna. She's a microbiologist that specifically is interested. So as a microbiologist, she studies the interaction of the compounds that we're sending her on individual organisms that live in our mouths. I mentioned Streptococcus mutans, but there are many others that I show you here, including the fungus Candida albicans. But what's special about Christina Schäfer is that she goes beyond one compound, one organism, because she's particularly interested in what is called multi-species biofilms. That's, after all, what's taking place in our mouths. The biofilms that build on your teeth and on your gums, where multiple organisms are residing. And that becomes a more interesting aspect of this study that is ongoing. We're also interested in seeing how these molecules are interacting with the human immune system. And we have preliminary observations that come about with collaboration with Professor Salome Leibengut at the University of Zurich. She specializes in multi-species organisms in humans, and in particular, human immune response to these multi-species films. And what she's reporting to us is that there's an increase in interleukin-6 production in the presence of mutanobactin D. That's the first one that we made. If you know a little bit about immunology, the production of interleukin-6 is consistent with interaction with the human host. So it looks like these molecules are mediating interactions with microorganisms, between microorganisms, and now with us. And so they represent a fascinating system to study. That leads to some questions which we're currently investigating. Does Streptococcus mutans use the human immune system to defend itself against its competitors? And then in turn, are we using S mutants at the risk of gaining cavities to help us fight fungal infections? These are fundamental questions that can now be addressed given that we have access to these natural products. And as you saw in that last route, convenient access to a host of these natural products. And so one of the things that we're interested in looking is combinatorial chemistry meets combinatorial biology, where we're going to be able to look at cocktails of chemicals. After all, that's what's being formed in your mouth, with mixtures of organisms, and trying to sort out the interesting human biology and human biochemistry that's taking place from multiple chemicals, multiple compounds interacting with multiple organisms in us. So that's what we've begun to do. I don't have all the time in the world to tell you about some of those results, but as you can see from the figures way at the bottom, we're studying with our colleagues in Vienna biofilm formation, and what the result of these organisms, of these compounds with these organisms are. So it's, as I mentioned before, combinatorial chemistry, in the sense that we can now access all of these compounds individually or as mixtures, meets combinatorial biology. And so we're very excited about that. So let me summarize it. Since I'm told I had 40 minutes, I tried to stick to that. The chemistry, I've showed you the first total synthesis of mutanobactins A, B, and D from the human microbiome. I've shown you, well, I really discussed only two approaches, but three different approaches. The first one was based on a highly selective 1,3-dipolar cycloaddition reaction. And the second one is based on solid phase synthesis methods. And at the very end, we take advantage of the acidic conditions to create the thiazepinone found in mutanobactin, in some of the mutanobactins. These studies have allowed us to assign the configuration of these molecules. Finally, we're now using these molecules, so it doesn't end here. We're using these molecules to start to understand interspecies communication in the human microbiome. I should tell you that we've already seen strong synergistic effects with amphotericin B, an antifungal agent that's often used to treat outbreaks of Candida albicans in humans. I've indicated that we're seeing preliminary results, that there's activation of the human immune system. And with Christina Schaefer, we are seeing that these molecules do have an effect on biofilm formation and interaction between various different organisms. So it's a beginning of, I think, of what's going to be a very exciting and rich story that we're going to stay on. And hopefully you'll stay tuned on as we make additional discoveries that are enabled by the synthesis projects. So let me thank the individuals that have participated in these projects. The Euforicanin project is largely the work of a single grad student, Moritz Clausen, in my group. The individuals below are undergraduates that at one time or another worked with Moritz and made significant contributions. I haven't shown you all the routes that we looked at. And so these undergraduates made significant contributions all along in terms of helping us ultimately identify the workable route. In the area of the mutanobactins, the students that are primarily responsible for the syntheses are Felix Pultar, who prepared mutanobactin D, and Moritz Hansen, who's still in my group, who prepared mutanobactins A, B, C, and D using this solid phase synthesis approach. I'm delighted to have excellent collaborators in the form of Suzanne Wolfram in my group that does the biology, Christina Schaefer in Vienna, and Salome Leiben-Gutlandmann at the University of Zurich. I didn't have a chance to tell you a fascinating story that's come out of this, and that's work with Professor Sarina Rineker of the ETH in physical chemistry. That's allowed us to confirm our structural assignment. I didn't know you could do this until we did it with her, using IR. And you use the information that's present in the fingerprint region of molecules to carry out the configurational assignments. It's a fascinating story. It's in the full paper that I cited, but I didn't have time today to discuss. I'm also grateful to a host of other individuals in the group and in the group of my collaborators that are continuing with the investigations that I presented to you today. Thank you for the opportunity to present these results to you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Professor. It was a very broad talk. Very interesting. If we have any questions, you can raise your hand and open up your mic.
Pueden ser en español si quieren.
En YouTube, creo que no tenemos. Yo tengo una, el estudio de la microbiota pues parece que cada vez más está ligado a diferentes padecimientos. ¿Podremos ser capaces algún día de arreglarlos a través de arreglar la microbiota?
Sí, creo que eso es un objetivo muy bueno de tener, ¿no? Por el momento va a ser con la química, ¿no? Pero cuando uno entienda más los procesos bioquímicos, los procesos moleculares, y eso en ciertos aspectos se está haciendo hoy en día, ¿no? Cuando uno recibe antibióticos, yo recibí antibióticos la semana antes pasada por una infección que tenía en los dientes, ¿no? Y me leí las instrucciones de los antibióticos, ¿no? Uno recibe hoy en día medicamentos, no sé cómo se dice, ¿no? O sea, además de la medicina que recibí una píldora que contiene microorganismos para repopular mis intestinos, ¿no? O sea, entonces, en ciertos aspectos se hace eso hoy en día, pero se conoce muy poco, ¿no? Entonces, mientras uno más descubra y entiende los procesos, vamos a tener mejor control Y creo que en realidad el control, ultimate control será ajustando los microorganismos, pero eso no será posible hasta que los entendemos y entendemos las moléculas con las cuales se comunican.
O incluso modificando genéticamente esos microorganismos.
Sí, sí, tienes razón. Lo
Bien, si
cual
no
no es
tenemos...
fácil, ¿eh? Lo cual no es fácil porque, si te acuerdas, había dicho yo que, lo que he leído, ¿no? Que estos microorganismos no son fáciles de cultivar en solo, ¿no? Necesitan la competición a los enemigos para expresar esos genes, se dice. Entonces, es un proceso muy fascinante que tiene aspectos de química y de biología, microbiología, química física también, ¿no? Porque estoy colaborando yo con un físico, biofísico, ¿no? Cómo se forman los biofilms en la boca y cuál es el acceso de los antibióticos, estas moléculas pequeñas, a través de esos biofilms. Entonces, es un problema que tiene muchas facetas muy interesantes. Y para mí, como químico, me interesa muchísimo aprender esas nuevas cosas.
Y me imagino que incluso de biología sintética, como los organismos semisintéticos de Floyd Romesberg,
Sí,
podrían tal vez tener alguna aplicación. Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias, profesor Carreira. Muchas gracias a todos por su atención.
gracias a ustedes y pueden contar conmigo en cualquier aporte que necesiten o trabajo que necesiten para la comunidad y para Latinx Chem.
Gracias. Vamos a esperar unos minutos a que dé la hora.